This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? Mark, what the hell is going on now?
Well, we are days away from the Trump administration taking office, and Donald Trump is one of his first things that he's going to focus on after he signs a bunch of executive orders on the border and repealing Biden's drilling bans and all the rest of it is he's going to swing into action to try and negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. I wanted to do this podcast and bring George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War on because George did a really interesting briefing that we both attended recently where he laid out the fact that Putin's in a lot of trouble in Ukraine. There's this perception out there that Putin is strong, Ukraine is weak, Putin is gaining, Ukraine is in trouble, Putin can do this forever. This is the country that defeated Napoleon and defeated Hitler, and that they have the long-term advantage. And what I think it's important for Trump to know is that he actually has a lot of leverage with Vladimir Putin. That Vladimir Putin is actually in a pretty weak situation. He's been trying to make gains on the ground in Ukraine and hasn't been able to. He's made marginal gains, tactical gains. He hasn't taken any major cities. He's been able to take some small villages and small areas, but at an enormous cost in casualties. And there was a story in the Wall Street Journal the other day. And I just want to read the beginning of it because I think it's really fascinating. It's Russia taps Soviet-era stockpiles as armored vehicle supplies dwindle. And this is the lead. When the director of Russia's largest film studio met President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin last month, he made sure to highlight how he had supported the war effort by handing over dozens of tanks and armored vehicles dating back to the 1950s. The company, Mosfilm, has used armored vehicles from Soviet eras as props for decades. Now, with the Ukraine war chewing through stockpiles, Mosfilm is turning them over. I was told they were needed, so I reached out to the defense ministry. Karin Shekernazov, Mosfilm's director, told Putin the donation of around 50 vehicles was a drop in the bucket, but an indication of how deep the deficit of armor has become for one of the world's most powerful armies. The Russians are using tanks and armored vehicles from movie props. I mean, that isn't symbolic of how dire their situation is in terms of their defense industrial base is atrophied. They are churning through troops by the hundreds of thousands, and they are not on a sustainable path. And so when Donald Trump goes and talks to Vladimir Putin, he's not talking to a man with a strong hand. He's talking to a man with a very weak hand who is masking a lot of flaws. And unfortunately, some in the media are helping him do that. But he has a lot of leverage when it comes to Putin in the negotiating table. He doesn't have to give him a lot. He doesn't have to feel like he has to entice him over to the negotiating table. He needs to force his hand because if he does what he says, which is he's not going to abandon Ukraine, and he has said that if Putin doesn't agree to peace, he's going to increase U.S. support for Ukraine. That is what Vladimir Putin cannot sustain. He could ride through the Biden administration with their slow rolling of weapons. What he cannot sustain is if Donald Trump decides you're the intransigent party and we're going to make you come to the negotiating table by force. That is a situation that Vladimir Putin will not be able to handle for very long.
I think that's right, Mark. One of the things that has been really striking to me over the last few years, it's not just the Biden administration, obviously. It was the first Trump administration, it was the Obama administration, it was the Bush administration, so maybe it's a 21st century problem, is that we tend to think of the media as being a cog in the left's domination of the commanding heights. That's a deeply sort of political statement. Obviously, there are lots and lots of exceptions to it. Terrific people at all the major papers and in the digital space as well. But what is striking to me is how often they get a hold of the wrong end of the stick on a whole variety of issues. We've seen this on Gaza. We've seen this on Iran. We've seen this on NATO. And I think that one of the most undertold stories by people like us who spend a lot of time looking at this sort of thing is how they've got the wrong end of the stick on the question of Russia and Ukraine as well. You know, It is remarkable. The Biden administration wanted to tell the story that Republicans were pro-Putin, soft on Ukraine. But actually, the story was that Biden was soft on Putin. Biden was bad on Ukraine, and that at the critical moments in the early part of the war, it was the Republican Congress that drove forward sanctions on Russia, that drove forward larger aid packages for Ukraine. It was the Republican Congress that forced the sequester of Russian foreign assets, $300 billion of which are now sitting mostly in Europe. So, it is remarkable to me that the story is not being told of just how bad this is for our enemy, Vladimir Putin. The desperation. When you're going to movie studios and asking for props, you're really not in a great place. And, again, for me, Ukraine has never been the story here. It's always been about Russia.
Well, that's absolutely true. And look, just to put this in perspective, to give you some figures. So Russia has gained some territory in the last year. They've gained about 2,600 miles of territory at a cost last year at a cost of 420,000 casualties. 420,000 casualties. Since December, they've been losing 1,585 people a day. That is not sustainable in the long term. The conditions are such, their losses are 10 times the Soviet combat deaths in Afghanistan. And there's a story in foreign policy that the average Russian infantry soldier lasts about a little less than a month on the front lines before being killed. So they're bringing these people in and putting them into a meat grinder. And they literally have troops whose job are to stand in the back and shoot anybody who retreats. These are not signs of strength. So Russia is not this great monolith, and Putin's not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I can give you chapter and verse as to why. They won't help him achieve his battlefield goals. The Russian military doesn't want to do it. They're not trained to fight on a nuclear battlefield. The winds in Europe go east. So the nuclear fallout is not going to stay in Ukraine. It's going to fly back into Russian territory. And also, it completely destroys his narrative of the war, which is that he's liberating his brothers in Ukraine from a Nazi regime that has taken over and oppressed them. You don't nuke your brothers. If the Russian people and the Ukrainian people are one people, you're nuking your own country, your own people. There's so many reasons why he would never do this. And on top of that, I would add the risk that the military won't carry out his orders. Radek Sikorski was on a really interesting podcast the other day, the Polish foreign minister, and he pointed out that this isn't just a Putin decision. There are a lot of people who have to carry this thing out, and he has to be pretty damn confident that if he gives that order is going to get carried out, because if the military doesn't carry it out, that could cost him his regime. So there's a lot of reasons. I guess the message I'm trying to get through is that Donald Trump has all the leverage in this. And when he sits down with Vladimir Putin to talk about Ukraine, he needs to go in there with confidence that Putin has a very weak hand.
I mean, what you and I are looking for here, one of the biggest complaints, and all of our loyal listeners know this about the Biden administration, is the projection of weakness. What we need to do is we need our enemies on our back foot. One of them is on their back foot, not because of the Biden administration, but because the Netanyahu administration in Israel defied the warnings, the threats, and the advice of senior Biden people, and in fact has now put Iran in the worst position that it has been in its 46-year history. Okay, so that's the case. The Ukrainians have done an amazing job of putting the Russians in such a bad position that they couldn't help Assad, except, of course, to give him asylum, that they couldn't help their ally Assad. They're probably going to lose their bases in Syria, their first post-Cold War warm water ports on the Mediterranean. They are going to lose that. And what our aim here is for the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, and the North Koreans to look at Donald Trump and say to themselves, this is no Joe Biden. This is a person we need to reckon with, because we don't know what he's going to do, right? It's not going to be just tariffs. It's going to be a lot of different attitudes to the role that America plays in the world and the willingness to tolerate threats. And I think that is critically important, because otherwise we are looking in Donald Trump's term at Iran getting a nuclear weapon, China invading Taiwan, Russia thinking it can chew up little bits of NATO. don't forget, it's not that everything stays the same if America does not act on the world stage. It doesn't stay the same. It gets much worse, and it is a much worse challenge. And for somebody who is a second-term president like Trump, this is your legacy, right? Are you going to leave us stronger, or are you going to leave us like Joe Biden has left us, weaker?
I don't think there's a
everywhere?
chance that those things that you said are going to happen on Donald Trump's watch. We may have a demonstration effect of this in the first days of the Trump administration in the Middle East, because he had a press conference the other day where he was asked about the hostages. And he said, those people better be freed by the time I am inaugurated, or all hell is going to break loose in the Middle East. And I don't think he means economic hell. I think,
I don't know what he means.
I don't know what he means, but either do they. And they ought to be scared, because one of the hallmarks of the Trump policy in the Middle East was that he didn't allow Iran to hide behind its proxies. He held Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies, which is why he killed Qasem Soleimani when an Iranian proxy killed an American after he had drawn a red line on that. So, it'll be very interesting to see what he does in those first days. If the hostages are freed, which would be a demonstration of American strength, and if they aren't, what he does to implement that, because that will reverberate not just through the Middle East, but through Asia and through Europe, and Putin and Xi are going to be watching that very carefully.
From your mouth to God's ears is all I can say. From your mouth to Trump's ears. I hope he does the right thing. But hey, you and I have now managed to bogart vast amounts of time away from our guest in talking about what the real situation is on the ground, because I think people are getting, as usual, a very false message from the mainstream media about how things are playing out in Ukraine. George Barros has been with us before. He is amazing. He's the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. He focuses on open source research and geospatial analysis. He focuses on Russian information operations, Ukrainian politics. Before he joined ISW, he worked in the House of Representatives as an advisor on Ukraine and Russia for a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. You guys are going to love this.
Here's our interview. George, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Mark. Good to see you again. Thanks so much for having me. Hey, Danny. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. So we want to get a sit rep for you on what's going on with the situation in Ukraine as the Trump administration prepares to take office. But one of the things that we particularly wanted to talk to you about is, as we go into this period of new negotiations, there's this idea that Russia really has the upper hand. That Ukraine is small, weak, and it's losing a lot of people. And yeah, Russia's losing a lot of people, but they've got a lot of people and they've got a lot of resources. And they can do this with one hand tied behind their back for this stalemate for decades, and the Ukrainians can't hold out. And so therefore we need to sue for peace, and Russia has the upper hand. And what drew me to ask you to come on and talk about this was this big Wall Street Journal story recently, which said that the head of a Russian film company called Mosfilm met with Putin, where Putin asked him to hand over all the old Soviet-era tanks that they had that had been decommissioned in the 60s and given over to be used in movie sets because they needed them for Ukraine. And I thought to myself, the fact that the president of Russia is actually personally meeting with the head of this company to get back 1960s Soviet tanks, that's not a good sign for Russia. Talk to us about what that signifies and what the state of the Russian capability is.
Look, Mark, I don't want to sugarcoat it. The Ukrainians are facing some really serious challenges internally, externally with the resourcing. The Ukrainians need to be kept alive and in this fight. And I think a lot of ink has been spilled on the challenges facing Ukraine. But I've been really disappointed with the lack of coverage about all the problems that are facing Russia. And in particular, over the last 3 years, all the accumulated risk that the Russians have taken in fighting a protracted war that Putin did not plan to become a protracted war. I think when we talk about Russia now, it's really stretched further than it has been since the early 1990s. The analogy that I like to use is that Russia is sort of like this sitting perched on this three-legged stool, and the stool is becoming increasingly wobbly. The three elements of this stool are, number one, Russia's defense industrial base and their historical legacy access to all of the Soviet inherited military equipment, which is a finite resource. The second one is Russia's demographic problems and how the Russian generation system for new forces is starting to fail. And then the third one are economic problems, and they're all sort of connected. I'll run you through these really briefly. But suffice it to say, the bottom line up front is that these problems get worse with time. This is a vice of Russia's own creation that gets tighter over time. And really, if we want to support the Ukrainians in a negotiated settlement, we really should do so from a position of strength. And this leverage becomes more potent with time. So let's go into these really briefly. Look, Russia is on track to run critically low on Soviet-era heavy mechanized equipment, vehicles, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles. The Soviet-era stocks of these equipment is on track to be depleted by late 2025. I can't provide a specific date, but all the good analysis of these storage vehicle sites indicates that by this time next year, Russia's going to be having a lot of problems. And it's not only the storage, but it's Russia's organic capacity to produce them. The Russian defense industrial base is also atrophied. There's a grand total of 2 rotary forges in Russia that make new tank and artillery barrels. Meanwhile, the Russian military loses about 320 tank and artillery barrels per month. The Russian ability to produce that's only 20 tank barrels per month. We know that Russia's single tank factory, Uralvagonzavod, only produces between 20, maybe 35 new tanks per month of serial production. Russia's artillery advantage over Ukraine in recent months has been reduced from 5-1 to just 1.5-1. So look, the Russian defense industrial base, if we continue trading the Russians at the current tempo, it's just going to get hairier and more precarious. Second leg of the stool, the Russian force generation system. The Russians have been able to offset what they suffer in Ukraine so far for about the last 2.5 years. The Russians lose about 30 to 45,000 casualties, killed and wounded per month. The system for generating these forces is essentially this form of neo-feudalism where Russian governors pull together a series of volunteers, they're called volunteers in Russian law, to go fight in Ukraine. And the Russians achieve that by offering these financially huge incentives to go fight in Ukraine. There's actually a new record that was just set by Samara province. Now you can get 4 million rubles for a one-time sign-up bonus to go join and volunteer to join the Russian military. Meanwhile, the average Russian annual salary is 1.2 million rubles. The 4 million rubles, that's about $36,000 for a one-time lump sum cash payment. And over time, you can look at how these bonuses and incentives have increased. And you can actually see how the Russian system for pulling these guys has had to become even more costly. And it's actually not working. You can continue to raise the prices, but you are eventually going to start running out of people. For the first time in last quarter, we observed reports of Russian governors beginning to petition the Russian Ministry of Defense and asking that their monthly quotas be lowered because they're increasingly becoming delinquent in actually meeting them. And this sort of segues to the final leg, which is the Russian economy. Look, Russians can either serve on the front lines in uniform, or they can work in the domestic economy and provide labor, but you can't do both at the same time. Russia has a labor shortage of about 1 million people, which they are not able to offset. When you continue to lose 30 to 45,000 people per month, it just gets even worse. We know that Russian inflation is out of control. Back in October of 24, inflation was up by about 8.5%. Back in October, the Russian central bank also raised the overnight lending rate up to 21%, which is insane. The liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, which the Russians have been using to bail out their war industry and keep them afloat, has decreased precipitously since 2022. It's now, the liquidity portion of the sovereign wealth fund is now just down to about 5.5 trillion rubles, or about $56 billion as of last November. And that's down from the original total of about $140 billion since before Russia invaded Ukraine in 22. And of course, within Russia, consumer products markets have become really, really hairy, with the cost of butter up by 25%, widespread egg shortages, the ruble trading less than 1 cent on the dollar, etc., etc. So, Mark, what's the big picture? Suffice it to say, so long as we can keep the Russians on this collision course over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, the likelihood of us getting some sort of breakthrough, either on the battlefield as the Russians run out of equipment, economically with breaking the back of the Russian economy, similarly to how we did in the 80s with the end of the Cold War, or diplomatically with a breakthrough, as Putin really wants to evade these hard challenges he's facing, especially as the specter of him having to call another round of mobilization becomes much more prominent. Really, we are served by these dynamics that work in our favor.
So, George, I suspect that a lot of what you've just described is news to people who have an interest in what's going on in Ukraine, but aren't sort of obsessively paying attention to all the elements. If you are a person who gets your news about what's happening in this conflict from the New York Times or the Washington Post or the mainstream media, you are hearing Ukraine is losing, things are really bad, they're definitely going to lose. And what you're describing to us is a situation where absolutely Ukraine is not moving forward in a way that it would like to, but in which Russia is fundamentally crumbling from within. And I'm doing this really long setup because it seems to me that people forget who our enemy is. Why do we care about Ukraine, right? Many people don't give a damn about Ukraine, its well-being, its people, or anything else. What they care about is our enemy, Vladimir Putin, right? They care about what is happening with him and his ability to threaten us, and his alliance with Iran, his alliance with China, his alliance with North Korea, his axis of evil, if you will. But what you're describing is a situation where we have an enormous amount of leverage against the Russians because they are on a knife's edge, incredibly precarious. Am I getting this wrong?
I think you're right, Danny, because look, Vladimir Putin has made the strategic decision that he wants to sacrifice on the altar of tactical small gains, territorial gains in Ukraine, Russia's combat power at the strategic level, and Russia's economic health at the strategic level, and the economic growth that Russia's made since the 2000s. This is really a good thing that we should lean into, I would argue, because it is degrading Russia's ability to threaten NATO conventionally. So insofar as Ukraine continues to saturate Russia's bandwidth. I mean, just recently, right after Thanksgiving, we saw how the Russian position in Syria crumbled. We were also concerned about Russia's foray and entry into the Syrian civil war in 2015 and how that could usher in a new symbolic era of Russia geopolitical resurgence with them doing their first expeditionary deployments to the Middle East since the Cold War, but the war in Afghanistan. The Russian positions in Syria have been crumbling, and right now it's an open question whether or not they even maintain their base in Tartus and Hamaimim. And that, we have Ukraine to thank for that. These are all positive and good things. And so, look, it would be a really big shame if we spent the last 3 years of sanctions, building up the international coalition against Russia, seizing the Russian assets, isolating Russia diplomatically, destroying their economy and their combat power in Ukraine, just sort of at the final couple yards down to the line here to then say, okay, we're going to let Putin off the hook. We're going to have some sort of ceasefire or operational pause that actually reduces the tempo of the fighting. And then Putin won't have to grapple with these really difficult decisions that he's going to be forced to face by simply saying, you're saved by the bell. And I think if we want to serve American interests and keep the Russians down, the best shot of actually doing that is leveraging the current pressure and ideally ratcheting it up as time goes by. I mean, now is a better time as any with the Russian gas deals to supply Europe just expiring over the new year and there being no clear Russian replacement for that income.
So basically what you're saying is that there's a perception out there that, yeah, Russia has problems, but it's much stronger than Ukraine. It's in a pretty strong position. They defeated Napoleon. They defeated Hitler. Time is on their side. They can win. And what you're saying is that going into these negotiations, that actually Trump has a lot of leverage, Ukraine has a lot of leverage, and that Putin's actually pretty weak going with his negotiating position going into these talks, right? That fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Exactly right. They've been running this marathon for so long. And to get to the tactical situation that for the sitrep, I mean, over the last quarter, the Russians really tried their hardest to project strength. They drastically increased the tempo of operations in southeastern Ukraine. And what did they get in exchange for it? Well, they managed to seize a couple thousand square kilometers worth of fields and small villages, and at the expense of losing tens of thousands of people and 5 mechanized divisions worth of equipment just over the course of a year near Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, which was Russia's primary area of focus for the entire last year. That's not good performance. In fact, that's actually really horrific performance. But Putin leans into this because he wants to create the impression that the map's getting worse for the Ukrainians, that Russia's moving forward. But really, no one's talking about the scale, the scope, the actual size of these gains, the cost at which the Kremlin is making it. And Putin wants us to think that he can just lean into this forever when, in fact, he can't. The Russians won World War II in significant part due to the fact that the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. We had Lend-Lease. Putin doesn't have that now, and Putin's defense industrial base has also atrophied since the 1990s, as has the Western defense industrial base. And actually, I would argue that President Trump can extract a much better deal and actually get the Russians to make some concessions that benefit American interests, the more that we leverage this positive momentum for us that's working against Russia.
So just to highlight the numbers, because this is from your ISW and Critical Threats Project assessment, since December, Russian forces have gained 593 square kilometers, or 18.1 square kilometers a day. They've lost on average 1,585 casualties. That is a horrific rate of attrition. And I saw one report that said that the average Russian infantry soldier lasts about 1 month on the battlefield before being killed or wounded and taken off the battlefield, and that they actually have Soviet-style barrier troops behind their troops to prevent them from retreating. Are those stories accurate?
As far as we can tell, yes. I mean, the casualty rates are catastrophic. It's harder to confirm the individual deaths, but we can confirm the vehicle losses because each of those are documented in great graphic detail from combat footage. And this gets to Danny's comment earlier about the New York Times coverage and the mainstream media coverage. Look, they really oversimplify complex military operations to try to get these punchy sound bites. Let's zoom in at a really tactical level to Russia's main area of operations that they focused on for all of last year. The area in Donetsk Oblast, Donetsk province, just outside of Donetsk city near Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. This has been the Russians' main area of focus. And over the course of almost a year, from about February of 24 till now, after the Russians seized Avdiivka in early 24, they only have managed to advance by about 45 to 50 kilometers, if we're being generous. They lost 5 divisions worth of mechanized equipment. That's like over 500 tanks, over 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers. That is absolutely horrific. And if you were to compare that metric over the time and the scale and the cost with what is normal for modern mechanized military maneuver, you would never use the phrases rapid or lines collapsing or any of the sort of coverage that we'd see. It's actually objectively poor. Compare it to what the Soviets did in the same terrain 80 years ago. You might expect to move 50 kilometers in a matter of days, not over the course of 12 months. Compare it to what American troops did in Desert Storm, if you like. But Russia's moves are actually glacial, and the costs are astronomical.
So, George, let me just ask you, and obviously we're here to talk a little bit about the state of the conflict, but when I look at Putin's leadership, when I look at the Russian economy as you've described it, when I look at the expenditures associated with this war, because it's not just blood, of course, it's treasure. What I see is a person who is risking everything for what amount to not terribly dramatic gains in Ukraine. He doesn't have Kyiv, he doesn't have major population centers, and he certainly didn't take over the country in 3 days. Should we infer that Putin's reign, his regime, is at some risk, or do we not see any of that when we look at the Russian political terrain?
Yeah. I think Putin's regime is pretty stable at this time. Putin is a student of what the Soviet Union did incorrectly, what the political leadership did incorrectly in the late 80s and the early 90s, and what led to the fall of the regime at that time. And Putin is correcting a lot of those mistakes. In the late 80s, you had a nascent Soviet civil society based around veterans, the mothers of killed and wounded Soviet Afghan war veterans. Putin has done his best to actually co-opt that group and make sure that it doesn't become a disaffected cleavage through various social promotion programs, by promoting these people, by getting them involved in government initiatives. I would argue that the Kremlin's become a lot more effective with policing internally the Russian population now with the advent of the internet and digital authoritarianism tools. Putin's doing a good job to ensure that his regime is solid. I mean, back in 2016, he established a whole new security service called the Russian National Guard, Rosguardia. It's not your American-style or Western-style National Guard. It's subordinate not to the Ministry of Defense, not to the General Staff, not to the Interior Ministry. It's subordinate directly to the Kremlin. But this is sort of a parallel, and it's not even part of the FSB. It's completely separate. And so, Putin's been trying to shore up his regime for a long time. But I think what Putin's trying to do here in Ukraine is he is trying his best to convince the West that Russian victory is inevitable. He's trying to minimize the risks, minimize our perception and understanding of what exactly it's costing him, so that we here in the West come to the misunderstanding that actually Russia's going to win here inevitably. And it's basically a big game of chicken. And so what we need to do is call the bluff, lean into it, and say, no, you actually have finite resources and you are going to crack. The goal here is actually to sustain the tempo, because if we let the Russians off the hook, then yeah, they will eventually win and they will be able to protract a war of attrition.
So I want to press on this question because you work with a ton of people who, like me, spend a lot of time paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East. And I think we all know that job number one for all of these dictators isn't the conquest of the local neighborhood. It's not the conquest of Ukraine or Lebanon or Yemen or anything else. It's regime security, right? The military that's job number one for the military. That's job number one for the economy, is to exist in service of regime security. And so when I look at what the Achilles heel has been, for example, for a regime that we would have said as soon as, maybe a year ago, had overcome its internal difficulties, for example, the Assad regime in Syria, right? When things looked good for them, actually there was consolidation of their adversaries. Now, does that simply not exist in Russia? Is there no serious domestic opposition? Obviously, our friend Vladimir Kara-Murza is outside. Navalny is dead. How important is that fact? Am I wrong that there's no domestic opposition? And once Putin runs out of money, or money starts to become even tighter than it is today, which I assume it will with the Trump administration and the end of some of the really kind Biden administration efforts to stabilize the Putin regime.
And gas revenue.
Right. And of course that includes especially the gas revenue. Will that change?
Yeah. Putin is facing regime stability challenges. There's many on the immediate horizon that he wants to evade. Do I think it's going to come to a critical crisis point, or that, there's a risk of his regime faltering in any serious or significant way? I don't think so. I think the biggest challenge that we saw to that was Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion back in summer of 23. And since then, Putin's really tamping down the hatches. If there was ever going to be sort of a dark horse moment, that was that, but it's come and gone, and Putin's going to be okay. What are Putin's immediate regime stability challenges at this time? Part of it is going to be the question with mobilization. Will there have to be another mobilization like how Putin did in September 2022? At the current rate of battlefield losses, I think it's just a question of when and not if. And of course, that has drastic implications for Russia's regime stability, and particularly Putin's regime stability, because inconveniently for Putin, he cannot scapegoat the responsibility for mobilization onto a minister or a deputy minister or a governor or something. As president of the Russian Federation, Putin knows that he uniquely owns the responsibility for calling mobilization, which is why he's been so hesitant to do so. I could name you half a dozen times over the course of the last 3 years when it would have made military sense to call mobilization to put Russia further on a wartime footing. And interestingly, Putin's actually been extremely timid. I think there's this misperception that Putin is sort of this military mastermind or the strategic mastermind who makes these risky gambles and sort of outplays the West at every corner and junction. He actually doesn't do that. He consistently does the militarily and economically stupid thing for the politically safe and expedient thing, because he's constantly trying to minimize the risk to his regime stability. And so what we've actually seen is a very timid Putin who will not call mobilization at critical moments, who actually will not take the steps that are necessary to ensure that he'll be having a successful military operation in Ukraine, but rather that minimize these threats. For example, I'll give another concrete thing. The Russians are doing their best to actually ensure that the military remains loyal to the regime and that the regime gets to control the military. This is a huge liability for Putin. My colleague at the Institute for the Study of War, Katerina Stepanenko, recently wrote a very interesting piece about how the Russian Ministry of Defense is actually stymieing innovation within these special, small, tactical drone shops that every Russian brigade and regiment have established. Historically, these Russian units would have drone enthusiasts that would set up these drone shops to then support their larger formations. And it was all done very much off the books, very informally. These were not formal units on paper. They're just sort of an attached little shop. The Russian Ministry of Defense created this bureaucratic system that wants to create a new branch for the drone services, and they're going to subordinate the procurement supply chain, the standard operating procedures, all this stuff, and unify under this really big behemoth entity that is going to stymie the growth, stymie their ability to innovate. And fortunately for the Russians, that's actually going to degrade their ability to experiment and use drones more effectively. But what it will do is it will ensure that the Russian Ministry of Defense gets to control everything and ensure that their standards can be enforced to the detriment of the Russian tactical prowess. So, I think the risk is actually quite low. But to the point of the critique of the Biden administration and the Washington conventional wisdom, we have been so concerned about Russian regime stability to a fault. I actually think that we've coddled Russia. We have allowed the Russians to have off-ramps and buffers and safety nets and all kinds of golden parachutes. And we have done so to Ukraine's detriment, to the detriment of U.S. interests. We've been so scared about Russia potentially facing battlefield setbacks on red lines and fear-mongering and scaremongering to the point where we have deliberately crafted our policies in a way to not be successful. And that baffles me. It really does.
To that point, isn't regime stability one of the because one of the things that's been the greatest deterrent for the Biden administration is this fear of escalation and the possibility that Putin might use a tactical nuke in Ukraine. Jack Keane has been on the podcast with us and sort of explained why that's unlikely, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But isn't regime stability one of the reasons? Because the Russian military, unlike the old Soviet military, is not trained or equipped to fight on a nuclear battlefield. It's entirely possible that if Putin decided to give the order to use a nuke, the generals wouldn't carry it out. And wouldn't that be the end of the Putin regime at that point? If he gives an order and they don't do it? I mean, that could bring down the regime, don't you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I had never considered that the officers would not follow through an order, because one thing that's interesting about Russian/Soviet military culture is that you always do what the boss says. There really isn't a culture of resigning your commission or refusing to comply with an order, that sort of thing. I assume that if they got the order to do it, they would. But I agree with you, Mark. Civil-military relations are quite poor, and that is the sort of thing that could break a brittle regime. But in any event, it's extremely unlikely because, look, I don't want to say Russia's red lines don't exist, but the premise that there's some red line that you transgress and ipso facto means that the Russian response is going to be nuclear retaliation against Ukraine or NATO or the US is absurd, because it is fundamentally always going to be Putin's personal decision about whether or not to employ a weapon of mass destruction. Russian doctrine provides guidelines for when the president should consider to make that decision, but it's fundamentally always going to be Putin's decision. And when you have a human decision in place in the chain, then it means you can shape that decision. And the great news is that I argue that conventional and nuclear deterrence will prevent Putin from doing that. I think that the fundamental logic behind mutually assured destruction that kept us all safe during the Cold War is still fundamentally valid. I think that Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine actually doesn't solve any battlefield problems. It won't help them destroy decisive amounts of Ukrainian forces or advance much faster due to the problems that you just described, and that it actually just creates more problems for Russia than solves, which is why the Ukrainians and the United States and NATO have been able to contest Putin's red lines in a variety of ways in the last 3 years, and they keep shifting the goalpost, and we've actually found out that the threats aren't that credible, actually.
Okay, we've talked a lot about Russia, and that was our goal here, because Russia is the reason that we are interested in this conflict. To keep trying to explain to people that that's the case. But let's talk a little bit about the state of the conflict. Let's talk about the mainstream media narrative that things are not going that well for the Ukrainians. I am firmly of the view that Donald Trump is going to continue to support Ukraine with a view to getting the best possible deal, as opposed to encouraging Putin to continue the conflict because he thinks he can eventually win, which is his narrative, and I'm sure he believes it. So what is the state of play? How critical is Western support to Ukraine's continued progress? What's going on?
Absolutely. General state of play. The Russians have the initiative across the entire theater, with the exception for the tiny little bit of the salient in Kursk, where the Ukrainians began a cross-border operation back in August. On January 5th, the Ukrainians resumed a new tactical attack in the Kursk salient. Jury's still out on what the effects of that are, but it's interesting. But suffice it to say, The Russians have the initiative. They control when to conduct attacks. They control at what scale, at what size. They're able to bully and push around Ukrainian units and pull them all which ways, twist the Ukrainian forces into a pretzel. The Russians are pushing. In particular, in this area we were talking about earlier, Donetsk Oblast, Donetsk province, near the town of Pokrovsk, they've been making tactical gains. That is to say, small-scale gains, not at the operational level of war, no operational level breakthroughs. What we see are Russians conducting mostly foot-mobile, dismounted infantry attacks across fields where the Ukrainians have pretty good visibility with drones and other reconnaissance systems. And the Russians die in massive droves trying to move from hedge to hedge, field to field. They have captured a series of very small villages, mostly completely destroyed and depopulated. I mean, the terrain there quite literally looks like the surface of the moon with all the craters and not a whole lot else, especially with the snowfall that's going on now. Over the last 6 months, the Russians have really only captured 2 towns of significance in this province. They captured Vuhledar in October, and then they captured Avdiivka back in the spring. But beyond that, they've captured no other operationally significant cities, and they've been moving at a very, very slow pace. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are able to conduct operational level maneuver. That is, effectively use mechanized vehicles to do a sort of rapid advance where you can break the lines and push through and forward. Neither side can achieve that. And that's largely due to the current nature and character of this war being defined by drones, very effective kill chains, very effective reconnaissance and surveillance, and the way that intelligence targeting data can be very rapidly deposed and taken to drone pilots and crew weapon system operators and frontline soldiers. So, what we really have is, over a long period of time, the map gets better for the Russians, but they're not seizing critical terrain. They're not seizing major population centers. It's a slow, persistent, gradual, attritional creep. It actually really has more in common with the Battle of the Somme than Blitzkrieg. And when the Russian pace of advance does increase marginally, all the mainstream media say Russia's rate of advance has significantly increased. And yes, that's correct on face value, but it's still within the context of this being really, really glacial. As for the Ukrainians, they're continuing to defend against incredible odds. The Ukrainians face problems with resourcing. The Ukrainians need to conduct more force generation. They have to do more mobilization. The Ukrainians have a training throughput challenge in that there are many Ukrainians that go to training grounds, but they're hanging back at their unit headquarters. They're hanging back at forward operating bases. They are not deploying further enough to the frontline positions. And part of that is a lack of vehicles. At the battalion level, it's very difficult to have personnel and material flow from the battalion headquarters to the company headquarters and to the platoon headquarters, because in order to do that, especially when you're under constant enemy surveillance, you need to be able to move quickly and in a protected manner and fashion, which is why it's so important the Ukrainians get Humvees, MRAPs, armored personnel carriers to actually help with the throughput so that the Ukrainians that are sitting back in the further rear areas can get closer to where they have to be at the front. There is a Ukrainian infantry shortage at the front lines, but that's not because Ukraine's military-aged men fighting population has been depleted. Far from it. It largely has to do with the training ground throughput issue, and also the requirement to properly actually equip those infantry so that they can go defend those front lines better. But there's no breakthrough on the horizon for either side.
So, George, just a quick clarification. When you say a lot of what the Ukrainians need is armored vehicles, right? That, to me, that doesn't sound like HIMARS, ATACMS, ammo. That sounds like the kind of thing that they don't necessarily need from the United States, but could buy from a lot of Europeans, Asians, anyone. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not special equipment. It's nothing bespoke that only the United States can provide. I mean, quite literally, even cars are useful. Cars, Humvees, trucks, anything that can provide that sort of mobility. Armored mobility in particular is super important for those Ukrainians, and I think you can substantially improve Ukraine's combat power, improve their manning levels at the frontline positions where they do have those infantry shortages by just making it easier to move the guys and the equipment from the back to the front. And there is a role here for Europeans to step. There is a role here for the Asians to step up. And yeah, this is not particularly expensive or sophisticated equipment that they need. They just need stuff at scale because this is a war of mass and a war of scale.
So one of the countries that is talking about stepping up, though, that they're having a bit of a constitutional crisis, is South Korea, because North Korea has sent troops to fight for Russia in Kursk. First of all, how are the North Korean forces performing? What does it say about Russia's combat manpower problems that they're using North Korean forces. And how do you see that playing out?
Like I said earlier, the Russians lose about 30 to 40,000 guys killed and wounded per month. The North Koreans sent 10,000 people, so that's about 1,000 casualties per month. So it's like 10 days worth of dudes. The North Koreans that we see operating in the purported combat footage is showing them as dismounted infantry running across fields, trying to make tactical gains, and the Ukrainians tracking them in numbers. I don't want to underplay their contributions. It's important. I mean, that is a substantial offset. My hypothesis is that the Russians want to stand up an alternative recruitment pipeline, and that this 10,000 deployment is not a one-time off. I think Putin would like to make it a more regular occurrence, because if he can get 1,000 or 10,000 guys a month, that can really put a dent in what Russia's monthly recruiting requirement is to maintain the current tempo of operations. Now, with these North Korean troops, they are very disciplined. They are very motivated, I'm sure, because the regime threatens their families at home. They come from the North Korean 11 Corps, which is North Korean Special Forces and Airborne Infantry, but they're not operating with armored support. They're typically just armored and infantry dismounts. They fight to the death. They do not allow themselves to be taken capture or prisoner of war. They have been instructed to commit suicide by detonating their own grenades before being captured. So they're fierce fighters and they fight to the death, but they're not, at this stage, I think, particularly effective. They can be useful for shoring up critical sectors. They can be used to march across a field and counterattack. But with the way that they're being used, they're not a game changer, and they're certainly not being used in operationally sophisticated combined arms attacks or mechanized assaults or anything like that. They are just, it's mass to sop up bullets and drones. Now, as for how it pertains to Russian force generation efforts, I think it shows it's a sign of desperation. Or maybe not desperation, that might be too strong, but it really does show that the Russian force generation apparatus is not working. I mean, when you need to offer 4 times the Russian annual salary for a one-time sign-up bonus, that's a pretty rough indicator. Russia's male prison population is tapped. Russia does not want to go into the politically sensitive regions of Moscow and St. Petersburg, where Putin's main political cleavages that he actually depends on actually live. And so really what he'd like to do is offset the requirements and stand up these alternative pipelines, which is why he's gone to North Korea, why he's tried to recruit Yemeni men through contacts with the Houthis. And for me, I read it as another indicator of how precarious Putin's position is. And really, finally, after 3 years of this horrific conflict, we're starting to really run the Russians down. And now's the time to exploit that to our advantage.
Exactly. Now is the time. It's not what the New York Times is telling us. Now is the time for Zelensky to give up. Now is the time to push Putin to the edge and then ask him, do you want us to push you over? Couldn't agree more. Thank you, George.
It's an exit question, George. If you were sitting down with Donald Trump in the Oval Office on his first day in office and briefing him on the situation and where his leverage is, you have 3 minutes with the president to give him your thoughts on what he needs to know going into these negotiations with Putin. What would you tell him?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I'd tell the president, Mr. President, look, you've built your professional reputation on making good deals. I think we all like making good deals. And I know that you also said that you want to end this conflict quickly. Well, I'd argue that you can actually make the best deal by running the Russians towards these problems that are on their periphery and that they are going to have to reconcile in the 12 to 18 to 24 month period. And so you should not subordinate the quick deal to the best deal. And actually, if Putin doesn't want to make concessions when you go and talk with him, then that's absolutely fine. Just tell him, okay, Vova, we'll see you in 6 months. We'll keep the Ukrainians in the fight. We'll continue supporting them, and we'll see how your economy and your tank supplies and your inflation is doing. And basically, have a good 2 quarters.
That's good advice.
Good. I hope you're going to have the opportunity to give that to him one day soon, because we need some actual leadership from the White House. We've missed leadership for a long time, and I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful that Donald Trump is going to provide that leadership, because it does, as you say, set himself up for making the best possible deal. You want both sides to feel like they have to be there, and so that's critical. George, thank you again for all of the great work that you do. You guys are unparalleled in the analysis and in the awareness of the situation and in the policy advice that you give. So kudos to you, kudos to Kim, kudos to Fred and the whole CTP ISW team. Love you guys.
Thank you so much, Danny and Mark. It's always a pleasure speaking with you too, and thanks for having me again.
Thank you so much. Take care.
So, Mark, what'd you think?
So, first of all, George is brilliant, and I'm glad that he is sitting there looking at all the geospatial intelligence, watching the videos of the tanks being destructed, counting up the tanks, counting up all these things, because ISW's work is incredible, and they are the premier source of information on this. What's interesting is Donald Trump wants to get this deal done quickly, because he wants the war to end. And I appreciate that. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of Ukrainians today, if you look at the polling, Ukrainians want the war to end. They want a negotiated end to the war. But speed is not his friend. Speed is Vladimir Putin's friend. And I think he needs to understand that the desire for speed gives Putin leverage. He should try and get Putin to agree quickly, but he should lay down a very tough line with Vladimir Putin about how this thing is going to close, and be willing to accept if Putin says no. And be willing to say, okay, we're going to, as George said, we'll see in 6 months. We're going to continue to arm the Ukrainians. And by the way, it's not going to be the way Biden did it. The model here for me is the campaign to destroy the ISIS caliphate, where he came in and took the gloves off that Obama had put on the U.S. military and unleashed the U.S. military on ISIS and destroyed them. Obviously not using U.S. military here, but unleashed the capabilities of the U.S. and its allies to help the Ukrainians really inflict some serious pain on the Russians and force them to the table, because Putin can't sustain this thing. He's got the weak hand. This is just like the ISIS war was a war that should have never happened, because Obama allowed the ISIS caliphate to rise. It should have never happened. This is a war that should never have happened. Trump says would never have happened if he is president. I agree with that. But he's inheriting it, and he needs to hold, I think he can negotiate a very tough, lasting deal if he is willing to make Putin the one who needs the speed to end it, not him.
I want to underscore something you said here. For Donald Trump, what's going to be most important, what's going to set the tone for the next 4 years, is what he does right when he's in office. He's been talking a lot about what needs to happen, as you say, with the hostages, with the American and Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. He's talked a lot about that. He's talked a lot about the fact that he wants to see a negotiated peace between Ukraine and Russia. How he handles this is going to set the tone for every single thing that he does over the next few years. And one of the most important things he needs to do is set the tone that he is not a man to be screwed around with, because I think that there are a lot of people, including people in his inner circle, who think that Donald Trump can be manipulated. I think Putin thinks he can play him. I think the Iranians think that they can play him. I think Xi Jinping thinks they can play him, just like Justin Trudeau, the late Justin Trudeau, thought that he could play him. And I think the answer to that is you can't. Okay. He may play a dope. He may play a silly guy. He may love capital letters and exclamations and, big talk. But the reality is, if he resists being manipulated, if he resists being played by these guys, he will set a tone for a very successful term. And if they take him, if Russia gets a better deal out of this than they should do based on the situation on the ground, that will set the stage for his weakness over the coming 4 years.
Yeah, I don't think that's a worry. Trump is not.
I worry.
The Biden administration was desperately afraid of escalation. Donald Trump makes other people afraid of escalation. That is his MO. I think that I'm willing to, if I'm wrong, I'll say it on this podcast and I'll write it in my column in the Post. But I don't think that you don't want to compete with Donald Trump you don't want to go up the escalation ladder with Donald Trump, because you're going to lose. And I think the way his strategy is to go straight to the top of the escalation ladder and dare you to come along, but also allow a path for negotiation. And I think that he's willing to do that in the Middle East, and I hope he's willing to do that in Ukraine.
Well, we're going to see very soon, because inauguration is coming,
It won't be
folks.
speculation anymore. It'll be the game will begin. The Super Bowl is about to start.
Exactly.
The Super Bowl of geopolitics.
Good, folks. See you soon. Take care.
Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.